Salutations and felicitations, sir, and a most jocund welcome to the sink. I am your electronic valet and household central processor. May I be of service, sir?
The sync personalities are one of the best elements of the DLC, and unsurprisingly they have some interesting cut content. Most of the sync personalities have an installable upgrade that gives them some additional functionality. Each of the personalities that can be upgraded were meant to play a unique line afterwards, but a note reveals that all of these were intentionally disabled early in development. Instead, they only play a generic greeting after being upgraded, which is too bad because these lines would have been a nice touch. First, you could tell the Sync Central Intelligence Unit the line, "I have some personality holotapes to install."
Very good, sir. Merely interface the holotapes with my console's input-output port, and I shall upload them directly.
Next, you could tell the jukebox, "I found a Soundwave file for you." It would then reply in one of two ways depending on the player's gender.
Right on, Daddy-o. Just plug it in and I'll mix you up a sweet, sweet sound. Right on, baby. Just plug it in and I'll mix you up a sweet, sweet sound.
The book chute could be told, "I have a backup copy of your pencil processor."
Excellent. Now I can turn pencils and clipboards into items more useful to society, like lead, spare parts, and duct tape.
If you found the upgrade for Light Switch 01, you could say, "I found a holotape to upgrade you."
You found my smart lights. Installing upgrade.
You could tell Light Switch 02 the same player line as well.
Ooh, you found my mood lighting. Installing upgrade.
While the auto dock could be told, "I found some upgrade disk."
Well, that'll do just fine.
Finally, you could tell Muggy, "I found that upgrade disk you were looking for."
Oh, thank God! Finally, something resembling a useful purpose.
A toaster is just a death ray with a smaller power supply. As soon as I figure out how to tap into the main reactors, I will burn the world!
The toaster is easily one of the most memorable characters from the entire game, and it was based off of a toaster who would have appeared in the EPA facility, a location that was cut from Fallout 2. This toaster was named the Brave Little Toaster, a reference to the children's film of the same name that gave me nightmares as a child. Its entry in the design document reads, "The Brave Little Toaster. In one of the abandoned kitchens in the EPA is a small intelligent toaster with an IQ of 6,000. All of its brain power is focused towards convincing humans to make toast. Dialogue with it will be somewhat one-sided, and it will respond with some questions about whether the player will like toast or waffles. While the toaster seems like an incidental piece of strangeness, the toaster does happen to mention in its dialogue, almost in passing, that it is broken and can't access everything it needs in order to successfully make toast. If the player repairs it, then the toaster can provide him with the following: the secret code for the vault in one of the New Reno casinos, which is otherwise near unopenable, some secret codes for jinxing the slot machines out of their cash, and some other bonus items. This was a great concept, and it's too bad it was cut from Fallout 2, but thankfully the character was further improved upon when it finally appeared over a decade after its conception. Notably, the toaster is the only sync personality that can't be upgraded. It's possible they wanted to include one for it as well, but there's no remnant of it if so. The toaster is referred to internally as Toaster of Doom, a fitting name for an appliance attempting to destroy the world with atomic fire. The toaster's voice acting is one of the DLC's highlights, but Chris Avellone revealed they didn't actually intend to use his final voice actor originally. Jace Hall was brought in initially as a skit for the Jace Hall show to be bad and then fired. Then we went ahead and recorded him for real, and people seemed to enjoy his character in Old World Blues a lot. Jason Bergman revealed more, saying, quote, "We knew we would get a great segment for the Jace Hall show, but in case it didn't work out in game, we were going to have Roger Cross, who also played Ulysses and the Biological Research Station in Old World Blues, record the toaster. That was our backup anyway, but it's a good thing we didn't need him, because we were pretty pressed for time in the studio that day."
Oh, please, please tell me you brought me some coffee cups.
Chris Avallone revealed that Muggy was considered as a companion, as well as other NPCs from the core game. If there'd been time and the inclination, having Sunny Smiles, Yes Man, Benny, Wolpus, Victor, and others as potential companions would have been great. So would have Muggy, we wanted to, but adding a full companion through the DLCs that would work in the core game would have taken more time than allowed. It's really too bad they couldn't include any DLC companions that returned with you to the base game, as Muggy would have looked amazing blasting legionaries and NCR soldiers. Speaking of Muggy, he can't be damaged and has no reaction to attacks. The code that makes him immortal has a note that says, "Muggy, don't hurt Muggy, he just loves mugs."
I'm the original, certified, rarefied, testified GS-2000 Biological Research Station. Yes, sir.
The Biological Research Station is missing 4 lines of dialogue. Since these lines are completely missing, it's unknown if they were related to some additional functionality or if they simply would have fleshed out the world. There was also meant to be a working Nuka-Cola machine that the player could buy various types of Nuka-Cola from. In-game, its name would have been Hollow Vending Machine, and code reveals that for 20 caps the player could buy a regular Nuka-Cola, they could buy a single Nuka-Cola Quantum for 30 caps, a Nuka-Cola Quartz for 40, and a Nuka-Cola Victory for 75. After some time passed, these items would have restocked and the player could buy more. Unlike other Nuka-Cola machines, this one would have been pristine, as it uses the clean texture. Script dates suggest this was started very early in the DLC's development and was never returned to. Notably, there's a Nuka-Cola machine inside the sink's interior, and presumably this is where it would have appeared. This can be restored by Panzerman's mod Nuka-Cola Machine Restored, and there's a link to that below. There's an unused terminal called Sync Research Terminal, which appears to be an early version of the Sync Central Intelligence Unit. After accessing it, it would have displayed the welcome text Big Mountain Research Network. The menu options are research projects, log entries, and requisition supplies and equipment, but the submenus for all 3 options are sadly missing, however.
You can have as much as you like. Just, please don't put your lips on the faucet. It's so unsanitary.
At one point, if the player asked the sink if they had water, the player would actually play an animation to drink water, but a developer note reveals this was disabled since it didn't work well in third person. Beside the Biological Research Center, there's a refrigerator that contains various consumable items. Intriguingly, there's an unused miscellaneous item called Sink Upgrade Refrigerator, suggesting there were plans for an upgrade to the refrigerator. The code is missing, so it's unknown how this would have functioned, but perhaps higher quality items would have spawned inside of it, or maybe you could transform Nuka-Cola into its ice-cold variant. Notably, all of the personalities that can be upgraded are voice characters, and perhaps they considered including the refrigerator as a personality too. Regardless, this upgrade could have been a cool addition. All of the Sync personalities are objects, and their dialogue is actually played by several unseen NPCs contained in an inaccessible test level. I love hidden content like this, and it's really cool to see how these characters work behind the scenes. You ever get the feeling you're being watched? Well, that's because there's 2 NPCs placed inside your bedroom in the sink who are used to play Christine and Ulysses holotape dialogue. The sink's merchant chest can also be found just outside of bounds of the cell. There's unused early versions of the perks the player receives for recovering their spine, heart, and brain. The prototype version of Big Brained was called Brain Full and reads, "Your brain is back in your body, and it's smarter now. You gain experience at an increased rate, plus 10%. You gain 1 additional skill per level. Your intelligence is higher, plus 1 intelligence, and your science skill has been raised by 10. The early version of Cardiac Arrest was called Heartful and reads, "Your body once again pumps with blood and passion. Your barter and speed skills have been increased by 5, and your ability to shoot an enemy's heart is increased, plus 10% VATS to the torso. While the reinforced spine perk was called Spineful and reads, "It's good to have your own spine again. You're more agile now, +1 agility, a bit sneakier, +5 sneak skill, and you've gained more confidence in your posture and movement, +1 charisma." It's possible these perks were overpowered and that's why they were eventually reworked. Regardless, these lost perks can be restored by the mod Old World Blues Uncut Perks by Dazzanator, and there's a link to that below in the description.
Hello, it's nice to meet you. Who can I hide you from today?
Many of the DLC's main quests revolve around collecting various items from dungeons, and during the quest Attack of the Infiltrator, the protagonist recovers the Aural Stealth Suit MK2, cutting-edge stealth armor made by the researchers of the Big Empty. Beyond simply providing a stealth boost, this armor has an onboard computer that injects stimpaks and medics into the player as needed, voiced by actress Veronica Belmont, who also provided her vocal talent for Light Switch 01 and 02. The suit reacts to a wide array of situations, like commenting on the environment, the player unequipping it, turning the Pip-Boy light on, running out of medics, and sometimes even attempts to save a dead player by injecting their corpse with stimpaks. These attributes make it the most complex armor set in New Vegas, and because of this it also has more cut content than any other item, perhaps more than any other item in the entire franchise. The prototypes found in-game suggest it was based off of Chinese stealth armor, but code reveals that its functionality was actually based off of the prototype medic power armor in Fallout 3. Some of the actor effects from Bethesda's armor were also ported over, giving the suit the ability to automatically apply medics to the player without any risk of addiction. Another effect would have ignored the consequences of crippled limbs and suppressed the effects of all other addictions simultaneously. This early code still remains, but was never used. The stealth suit can be upgraded multiple times at the X13 facility by completing various stealth tests, but script notes reveal that the most intriguing test never made it into the final game. It reads, "Added sneak variable for image space special effects controls of advanced optics." Then a developer note beneath it mentions, "Deleted advanced optics section because VR test is being deleted." The mention of a VR test being deleted is particularly interesting, as there is a VR room in the dungeon, but it's been destroyed and can't be used. A note found beside the corpse of a dead researcher explains why it was destroyed, stating, "With my dying breath, I write that I hate the VR simulation so much. It has killed us. Now I will kill it." However, this note was seemingly added in later on after the real purpose of the room was literally axed. The only endgame remnant of this seems to be the room's position in the interior cell. Unlike the vast majority of other rooms, it's completely disconnected from the rest of the location, and the player is teleported there after accessing the linked door. Tantalizingly, there's still a remnant of the original undestroyed VR terminal. If you tried to activate it before you found the stealth suit, you'd get this cut message called X13 VR program warning. To activate this terminal, please equip the stealth suit MK2. It seems the player would have originally completed the first 4 tests before traveling into the VR room, where they would have been transported into a simulation, as there's an unused Tranquility Lane pod in the game files named X13 VR pod. Interestingly, the VR pod barely fits into the room and insinuates that the layout was once different earlier in development, or at least planned to be larger. Supporting this theory, there's an unused container that would have been used to hold the player's gear, suggesting you would have had a different and likely limited inventory inside the simulation. There's also 3 unused sounds related to this, named X13 VR Success Alarm, VR Transition Sound, and VR Fail Alarm. These use placeholder sounds from the strip, like the main gate alarm and the noise of a neon sign. There's even still a sign here that tantalizingly teases this room as Stealth Test Area Number 2. There's also an unused acoustic space called Interior Tron Room, which is likely linked to the VR sim. It would have looped the ambient music made for the Lucky 38 basement. So, what did the VR test consist of and look like? Well, there are mentions of holograms and what's left of the room's code, so perhaps the player would have snuck around hostile holograms to reach an objective. There's a reference to friendly holograms appearing here too. Notably, the Verakeys and Security Guard holograms are present in this DLC, along with the hologram beam weapon, but none of them were ever used. Further, there are some cut factions for holograms that are likely linked to all of this. The only holograms in the final release are the 2 friendly holograms inside the Z38 Light Wave Dynamics research facility. As far as what the simulation would have looked like, there's a massive number of unused set pieces named after the location. Some of them were clearly intended for the main X13 interior, but some of them might have been intended for the simulation. Most areas do have unused set pieces, but it's rare to find so many that were cut. Most notably, there's a set piece called X13 Hidden Room. Presumably this room would have had some cool loot and might have been related to the VR test, but was never placed either. There's also some kit pieces that don't have a GEC entry but are present in the BSA files. These neoclassical arches are from Fallout 3's DLC The Pit, and there's nothing like this architecture in the final area, suggesting they might have been intended for the simulation. If the player completed the virtual reality test, they'd be rewarded with the advanced optics upgrade, and the stealth suit would play this cut line. This line is set up to play in the GEC, but it can never happen due to impossible conditions.
Test data processed. Advanced optics online.
There's a related cut script called Stealth Suit Image Space Special Effect, and notes imply the advanced optics upgrade would have given the player some kind of vision upgrade, potentially night vision. In fact, one of the poster schematics still references this, implying that goggles were planned and later scrapped. It also mentions some kind of wrist knife functionality, but it's unknown if this is simply flavor text or if it was actually planned as well. When the player crouched, the Ultralux radio signal found sound would be triggered, and then 2 image space modifiers would be applied. When the player stood up, the modifiers would be removed and the Ultralux radio signal lost sound would play. There's even some unused code that would stop this effect from triggering when the ending slideshow is playing. During my interview with area designer Robert Lee, I asked him about it. The broken VR room originally teleported to a combat test level someone created for testing weapons. I thought the space looked interesting, so I tried to salvage it as a VR test space, but there were too many art/collision bugs, so it got cut while I was on vacation for Christmas. Intriguingly, there's no DLC-specific combat test level, implying it was removed prior to the add-on's release. This is undoubtedly some of the DLC's saddest cut content. As a VR simulation in a new environment with holograms and hidden rooms could have been an awesome final challenge for the stealth suit and the X13 dungeon. Ironically, the challenge related to the X13 test is still called VR the Champions, even though the entire VR section was sadly cut. Interestingly, the VR room code refers to the room as Holodeck, a reference to Star Trek. Comparing these two rooms makes the inspiration pretty clear. After leaving the X13 facility for the first time while wearing the stealth suit, it was supposed to play this line, but it appears to have been forgotten about and doesn't play. A note for the voice actor states, "Quiet amazement."
Wow, what is this place? Are we outside?
There's also code to make the suit comment on various perk implants. It had a line for each implant, and these would have played if you had the GRX, C13, M5, Y3, or Y7 implants. There were also corresponding lines for each implant the player hadn't acquired yet, perhaps meant to tease the player of their existence. Finally, there's a line for the suit detecting a new implant that would have been played when the player found one of the previously mentioned implants. In total, there were 11 cut lines related to this idea, but unfortunately all of them are missing. There's also a dialogue topic called Stealth Suit X13 Failbark, but it's completely empty. It seems the stealth suit was going to comment on you failing the test inside the X-13 facility, but these lines were unfortunately never recorded. Another topic is named X-13 Barks, but there's only a single line in this topic, suggesting that additional dialogue about the X-13 research facility was also cut. Interestingly, the voice lines for the stealth suit are played from an inaccessible cell most players will never see. There's a cell called Voice NPC for Stealth Suit MK2, and it contains a Mr. Gutsy used to relay the stealth suit's lines, as lines in the engine require an NPC to play. The stealth suit also has a few notable bugs and oddities worth covering. Due to the way it was coded, when the stealth suit injects you with stim packs, your medicine skill doesn't affect how much you're healed. The final test in-game increases the player's movement speed by 20% when the suit is equipped. Or at least it's supposed to, but due to an oversight, no effect is applied to the player. Despite revolving around giving the player a stealth bonus, the suit is strangely classified as medium armor, which almost defeats its entire purpose considering that medium armor makes significantly more noise while moving around. In summary, it was intended to feature significantly more dialogue, additional functionality, and a fascinating VR-based quest, which would have solidified it as the most impressive armor set in the entire game. During my interview with Robert Lee, I asked him about his inspiration for the item, as well as its cut content. I've always been a fan of talking weapons and items since playing pen and paper Dungeons & Dragons with friends. It's not something you see in most games, and offers writers an incredible amount of flexibility to flesh out a personality. It's also really cool how talking items can often become much more endearing and memorable than most humanoid characters. I can't take credit for the talking part though. I'm not sure who suggested it once they saw I had the stealth suit's automated features set up and working, but I'm glad they did. Maybe it was something I joked about in a review meeting, thinking that we wouldn't have the time or budget, but it may have been Eric Beaumont who suggested it. I was ecstatic when he showed me what he had added to my script. It really kicked the stealth suit through the roof. I just wish we had more time to really polish with more dialogue lines and options to custom tailor its behavior to the user. That came down to production timelines, and it wasn't a high priority. Oftentimes you get to a point in production where you've got all of the dialogue recorded for something, and stuff that wouldn't take a ton of time to tweak just can't happen because VO is in lockdown. It's not like we can just call up the voice actors to walk into the studio and add some lines. It would be ideal for developers, but the Screen Actors Guild and other processes get in the way of bursts of late game creativity. If you're a modder doing your own voiceover and audio, count yourself blessed. On top of the think tank's exterior, there's a very strange dead member of the Followers of the Apocalypse. This can't be reached or even seen without exploits or console commands, making the NPC's placement even stranger. During my interview with Chris Avalone, I asked him about it. Holy shit, no idea that was there, that's awesome. It looks like it was definitely placed on purpose. I didn't request it, but I did encourage the area designers to have fun with this DLC, so... Someone who might know would be either Sydney Wolfram, who built out most of the crazy environment for the crater, or Rob Lee again. I followed up with Robert Lee and he replied, "Not sure about that doctor. I'd need to see the location. Could be something Sydney Wolfram put in. Occasionally corpses get dropped into the world and temporarily moved to adjust terrain, then the person forgets about the object. Like frequently art updates will happen, a door needs to be swapped out for a new style that matches the new interior, and the artist will just move the old door above or below the interior geometry and not tell design about it. Designer goes in and puts the scripting on the new door to fix a progression bug, but doesn't realize the old door is hanging out under the world. Really sloppy, annoying workflow." While Robert Lee's reply explains the presence of many out-of-bounds objects, I don't think it applies to the dead doctor. There's a separate static bloodstain object placed directly beside the body, suggesting it was put here on purpose. Sydney Wolfram was the one designer I couldn't get into contact with, and it seems likely she was the one behind it, but sadly we'll likely never know her reason for placing it. Perhaps there was once going to be a way to access it in-game, or maybe it's just an Easter egg for intrepid boundary breakers like us. In the end, it's an awesome artifact of the game's development that will likely always remain a mystery. There's also a cut NPC named Countdown. It's possible she was a cut NPC the player would have met somewhere in the DLC, but the most likely explanation is that she was going to be used to relay the lines about Gabe exploding, as those lines are internally named Countdown as well. Ironically, Countdown shares the same face as Meg Reynolds, the mayor of Underpass, who was also cut. New Vegas has countless bugs, to the point where they're still being fixed by modders over a decade after its release, but Old World Blues contains what very well might be the game's strangest bug. I stumbled across some forum posts that mentioned it a few years ago, but I started to believe it was a hoax because I couldn't replicate it, until modder pushed the win button ran into it while working on a project. This bizarre and deadly oddity can occur when fast traveling from the sink balcony to Magnetohydraulics Complex. If the bug occurs and the game doesn't crash because of it, you're immediately teleported back to the sink balcony. But don't worry, you're not alone. At your exact location, the engine spawns a large number of active mines, along with some other completely random references, ranging from hammer, circuitry, and cask, to lobotomite, cyberdogs, and night stalkers. You're all then immediately killed by the mines. Fucking incredible. By slowing down time, we can see everything spawning right on top of the player's location, one after another. Apart from the mines, there appears to be no consistency to what spawns along with you. Some enemies, like lobotomite, seem to spawn more often than other options, but sometimes no enemies are called here and instead only props appear. None of these items are placed here, and it's not like they're simply being enabled. It seems there's some kind of memory issue that summons these random objects and NPCs, but it's such a rare bug that it's barely been documented. The bug doesn't occur when traveling from Magnetohydraulics to the sink balcony, and it doesn't seem to trigger when traveling from any other combinations of locations in the base game or the other DLCs. Even the number of mines seems to vary and can potentially be survived in some cases. Like, check out this dope dance move right before I get torn apart by a wild cyberdog. If you survive the mines and then travel back into the sink and return back to the balcony, it'll cause more enemies to spawn here once again, but this time without the mines for whatever reason. This is by far one of the strangest bugs I've ever experienced in all my years gaming. Old World Blues was intended to have an ending where the player joined the think tank and helped them wreak havoc across the wasteland. This was in a similar vein to the Dead Money ending where the player joins Elijah, which itself is a throwback to the ending in Fallout 1 where the player joins the Master. The script for the ending was written, and the ending slideshow was at least partially implemented in late February of 2011, but a script note reveals that everything related to this failure ending was deleted just a week after it was coded. One unused ending slide does remain though, and it depicts Legion soldiers floating in space. It's named Ending Slide Failure 08, suggesting that at least 7 other ending slides were cut, if not more. Years after the game's release, Chris Avallone leaked the ending script, and it reads, "In the decades following the Battle of Hoover Dam, the Big Empty remained a desolate stretch of wasteland, where few travelers dared venture. A note for the voice actor mentions, 'Curious, this is odd.' In time, however, a strange blue field began to grow, slowly spreading across the Big Empty. Lightning blue fields of force danced on the horizon like electrical storms. People whispered of floating spheres, floating like a rainbow of torches in the desert like old world wisp." Another voice actor note says, "Cold, curiosity changes to doom." Then communities began to vanish. Goodsprings was crushed beneath bizarre hexacrete blocks that stacked to the sky. The inhabitants of Prem winked out, flesh fried into X-ray silhouettes, their arms raised in surrender. A satellite fell on Jacobstown, beaming a kaleidoscope of bright blue equations into the deranged Nightkin minds, driving some berserk, paralyzing others. Black Mountain Radio began broadcasting a strange staccato static as hordes of giant, man-eating battle Brahmin began to swarm from its peak. Camp Searchlight became a garden of giant carnivorous plants, and the Colorado River shrugged one day, drowning several communities as its contours adjusted themselves. The Gomorrah became home to a particularly virulent vegetation-based STD that grew like a fungus within victims' genitalia until their bodies burst open like pods. The Legion East were systematically brain scrubbed and rebuilt so all the inhabitants believed they were in ancient Rome on the moon. And the human cattle of NCR were re-educated into believing they existed in perpetuity in a nationwide version of some place called Tranquility Lane. In the end, no one was sure who would crack the dome of the Big Empty, although it was clear that someone had been playing with forces they did not understand. Throughout all of this, the think tank was industrious, confident these experiments were all for the best, the results of the data they obtained incredible. They marveled that all of this had been waiting for them to come along and experiment since the war. The final voice actor note mentions, knowingly. Humanity certainly was persistent, no matter what experiments, nuclear holocaust or otherwise, it inflicted on itself. During my interview with Chris Avallone, I asked him why it was cut. We had this failure ending scripted for when you failed the DLC, but Bethesda asked us to remove it, so we did. I am happy we got the lines recorded though, and that it still exists on the net. Earlier this year, Chris Avallone made a tweet that seemingly suggested that Bethesda was unhappy with the Dead Money failure ending. Yep, it was the cut ending if the think tank won, and we had ending slides and everything. Bethesda was like, you better not do this ending shit again after Dead Money. Bad guys don't win, only Bethesda won. Old World Blue's failure ending was well written, hilarious, and would have been an all-around awesome experience. It's genuinely confusing why Bethesda would go out of their way to cut this, especially after it had been recorded and implemented.
They are large biological forms, breathing, heaving, snarling, coughing. Lobotomites are my teddy bears. Oh yes.
During the DLC, Dala mentions that she's obsessed with teddy bears. Interestingly, there's an unused item called Dala's Teddy Bear, which the player was seemingly going to recover for her. Where it would have appeared and what reward she would have given you is unknown though. There's a cut holodisc, and in-game its name would have been Blank Holodisc. There's no other information though, making it difficult to speculate on. The snow globe for Old World Blues is immediately transported to the Lucky 38, and the player never has a chance to see it in their inventory, meaning that its Pip-Boy icon can never be seen normally. This was a cool touch, and it's too bad it's missing, even if most players wouldn't have noticed it. Some of the headgear items added in this DLC, like the Valence Oscillator and Lobotomite Mask, have settings that turn the player bald when they're equipped. There's an unused holodisc object called Ulysses Map, which on activation would give the player the map markers for the locations Little Yangtze, Magnetohydraulics Complex, Elijah's Watch, Big Mountain North Tunnel, and Y-17 Medical Facility. It would have been found at the location Ulysses Point, which was the original name of the area where you would have met Ulysses in the base game. In a quote we'll be looking at later in this video, Chris Avallone noted the map also would have revealed the locations of the X-17 Meteorological Station and the Z9 DNA Preservation Lab. There's an unused miscellaneous item called Spare Component, and it was likely intended to be a crafting ingredient before it was cut, though what it would have been used to make is a mystery. There's a cut weapon called Meat Mine that uses the state consumable as a model. During the quest of Brain's best friend, the player can kill Dr. Boris's dog Gabe, and the Meat Mine was intended to be a method of completing this objective. Gabe even has an AI package that leads him to any nearby meat mines, though the weapon was never actually finished. The meat mine can be thrown and deals 1 damage per hit, but never explodes. This was a funny idea, and perhaps they could have been used against the other hostile cyber dogs found throughout the DLC as well. Speaking of Gabe, his name is actually in memory of level designer Jessica Johnson's dog, who passed away during the core game's production.
Oh, well, we came up with the idea of having a giant cyber dog at the end for the boss fight. And my dog, Gabe, had died about a year ago. He was a Great Pyrenees. He weighed 140 pounds. So not the biggest dog out there, but definitely a big dog. And so I named the villain, or the boss you fight at the end of, I think it's X8, Gabe. So Gabe is named after my dog.
Not far from Gabe, the player can find a modification for the sonic emitter called Gabriel's Bark, which deals additional damage to robots, characters wearing power armor, and knocks down enemies on critical hits. Interestingly, this knockdown effect was added from already existing code for Bighorner's attacks. This results in an unintended effect that causes Bighorners to be more likely to knock you down when attacking you. There's also a sound for Gabriel's Bark that has a more noticeable dog bark, but it was never used. There's a unique cut laser pistol called the X13 Field Disruptor Pistol. It deals twice as much damage as the normal laser pistol and uses microfusion breeders. It uses the same model as the laser pistol, plays the sound effects from the Alien Blaster, has the same impact data as a Power Fist, and on critical hits it would have had the Displacer Glove effect. But all of this might have been placeholders. It had a clip size of 10, and every 2 seconds it would regenerate 1 ammo like the Recharger rifle. Its name suggests it would have been found at the X13 research facility, and that the weapon likely had some damage bonus against robots. Considering that it uses a similar projectile, and the fact that the quest where the player upgrades the sonic emitter is called Field Research, this cut weapon is likely an early version of the sonic emitter. There's an unused weapon called Scorpion Rifle, a reskin of the grenade rifle from the base game. It would have fired tiny robo-scorpions that would attack your enemies. This weapon isn't present in the GEC, but its model and ammunition remains in the game's meshes file. These weapon assets were later reused for the Great Bear grenade rifle in Lonesome Road. There's yet another cut reskin of the grenade rifle called the Spider Rifle. Like the Scorpion Rifle, it doesn't have a GEC entry, but it would have fired spider drones from Fallout 3's DLC Operation Anchorage. This would later be reused in Lonesome Road as well for the Red Victory grenade rifle. During my interview with area designer Charlie Staples, I asked him about these cut weapons. For the Old World Blues DLC, we were trying to get in a weapon that acted like a grenade launcher, but instead of grenades, it launched a special grenade that spawned robo-scorpions to fight your enemies. We got this functional, but there were enough bugs with it and intermittent problems with the AI that we didn't have time to fix, so we cut those. I wish we could have gotten that working because I think that would have been really fun for players and would have fit in well with that DLC. While the layer appears in Old World Blues, it was actually intended to appear in the core game originally, as Chris Avallone revealed. One notable exception was the layer rifle, which was a model from New Vegas we didn't get to use in the main game. We decided to make it work in the DLCs. Its Vault Boy icon can still be found in the core game, and concept art for the weapon appears in the Collector's Edition guide. The texture and mesh for the Cosmic Knife and all of its variations from Dead Money are in Old World Blues files. The textures for the Knife Spear and its clean variant are also present. There's no GEC entry for any of these weapons, but the presence of these assets suggests they were considered for the DLC as well. The Proton Axe weapon is one of the DLC's references to Wasteland, the game that followed as a spiritual successor to. Wasteland also featured a Proton Axe item, which was the strongest melee weapon in the game. Another item the player collects during the main quest is the X2 Antenna, an EMP-based melee weapon that has a special attack called Pain Frequency, which costs additional action points but deals 200% damage. There's an unused actor effect intended for it that would trigger a visual effect and also paralyze affected NPCs for 10 seconds. This would have been applied to an area of effect, making it extremely powerful, and I'm guessing that's why it was cut. There's 6 unused creatures that would have been called sewer rat in game, but they're referred to as rad rats internally. An unused script causes them to deal explosive radiation attacks and also explode after dying. According to their name, they would have respawned like other enemies, and they're broken down into 5 separate tiers. They would have ranged from level 15 to level 50 depending on the player's level. The level 50 version would have had 650 HP and dealt 25 damage per attack, in addition to the radiation damage. They're a part of the Animal Friend faction and would have been non-hostile if the player had that perk. Their internal name suggests they would have appeared inside a sewer level, but there are no sewer areas in the Big Empty, suggesting the location that they would have appeared in was also cut. There's conveniently also an unused sewer grate door that's potentially related. There are a few sewer entrances in the DLC, one inside the X2 facility's interior and another at the Hazmat Testing Ground. Notably, Hazmat Testing Ground is one of the only labs in the Big Empty that doesn't have a corresponding interior, and I suspect the sewer level would have appeared here. These creatures were a really cool idea, and hopefully someone adds them back to New Vegas one day. Rad Rats would eventually appear in Fallout 4's DLC Nuka World, and later in Fallout 76. During my interview with Robert Lee, I asked him about the cut creature. I made the Rad Rats, but they were deemed too hard. Originally, they were going to be in a vault near Cottonwood Cove. Basically an irradiated vault with great loot, but tons of radiation to get through. At first I thought he was talking about Vault 34, which is a highly irradiated dungeon filled with high tier loot. However, this vault is nowhere near Cottonwood Cove. When I followed up with Robert, he revealed that the entire vault where Rad Rats were going to appear was cut. Unfortunately, he didn't provide any other information, which creates more questions than answers. A while back, I talked about the also cut Vault 24 jumpsuit, which has a slightly darker icon than other variants. Of course, there is no Vault 24 in New Vegas, and it isn't mentioned in the game files or any supplementary materials. It's possible that Vault 24 is the cut vault Robert mentioned, and that we now know not only its basic premise, but also one of the enemies that would have been found there. Sadly, we may never get more detailed information about the location, short of the design documents being leaked. The Y-17 trauma harness is one of the most haunting enemies in the series, but they were also one of the most complex creatures to make, as there's several early test versions of the creature. According to form IDs, the first attempt was a non-hostile creature called Dalt Test. This unfinished enemy was similar to the Y-17 trauma harness enemy, except that it doesn't have the harness armor. Interestingly, it was made from the companion bone, and killing the creature will fill both of the quests related to him. Later in development, a new creature was added called the Y-17 Animatronic Lab Skeleton. These guys are still in an unfinished state like Dalt Test, and have missing and stretched textures. It's possible these skeletons are simply test NPCs as well, but some evidence suggests they were actually meant to appear in-game. First, they were added to the Corpse Suit NPC faction, something that's typically not done with test NPCs. Second, there are easy, medium, and hard variations of this creature, as well as a boss version with a unique name called the Advanced Animatronic Lab Skeleton. If they were actually planned to appear, the easy, medium, and hard difficulty creatures would have been used to scale to the player's level, while the boss version likely would have had a unique name and would have appeared inside a dungeon. There's also a strange hostile creature called Wastelander 1, which was seemingly the next iteration of the monster. It's similar to the final version, but features an angry old man who's rocking skeleton hands. It was made using one of the cut bodies that were once going to appear at the Vicky and Vance Casino in Prem, and because of this it always spawns dead. Notably, one of Christine's holotape recordings mentions that the trauma harness creatures are found inside the Y-17 medical facility. Christine's original voice was notably also recorded by Veronica Belmont. A script note for the actress states, "In this log, Christine has just been operated on. She's not horribly weak, but definitely tired and worn out. She's committed to die."
This is Christine Royce, Knight of the Brotherhood of Steel, the Circle. Not going to make it through this. Hope someone finds this message. Gets it to the Brotherhood in the West. Tracked a rogue Brotherhood elder, Elijah, here to the Big Empty. Place is more than it seems. There's a crater hidden deep inside. Junkyard of pre-war labs scattered across the crater's surface. All still running. Like this one. Elijah's dissecting these centers, one by one. Tracked him to an old Chinese-American internment camp. Survivors, ghouls, have bomb collars. Robots moved in when I tried to intercept him. Elijah sent the camp ghouls against us both, like walking bombs. Got hit by the explosions. Woke up here. Guess the medical robots were programmed to bring wounded victims from the camp to this center. Some kind of autodoc prototype lab, manned by corpses trapped inside suits that keep them moving. No idea why. Not sure how long I'm going to last. Cut open my head like a lot of the humans I've seen here. Feel strange. Can talk, but can't hack the term. Wait, an explosion outside.
However, there are no operational trauma harnesses here or anywhere near the lab's exterior. Blind Dio Jefferson also mentions a character at Y-17 that doesn't actually appear there.
You heard of Doc Boney? Sang with the staff band till his wife caught him in bed with a nurse. Now he haunts the med center, still singing the blues.
It seems this boss creature was actually planned to appear as there's an unused AI package named Doc Boney Idle that would have made the creature guard the facility. Unfortunately, Doc Boney was either never made or deleted, but I made a mod that restores him and you can check it out below.
Interesting story. So because we didn't have a lot of art resources or sort of like character modeling resources for Old World Blues, we actually had to try and figure out a whole bunch of whatever new monsters we can make from existing assets. And one thing that one of our modelers, Kevin Manning, had done is for dead money, he'd actually, in order to get a skeleton placed right, he actually had to add bones to it as if it was a creature. So we had this skeleton that we technically could animate if we wanted to. And we're like, well, how would we use that? So we're like, why don't we just put it in a spacesuit and call it a trauma harness that's supposed to like go out to the battlefield and retrieve wounded characters and take them back to the doctor. But in Old World Blues, the trauma harnesses could never actually detect if the subject was alive or not. So they had all these corpses and dead bodies inside the spacesuits running around. But thanks to Kevin Manning actually adding bones to a skeleton in the first DLC, that's where we got all our trauma harness adversaries in Old World Blues.
Attention, lobotomites! Do not neglect to wash the walking eye!
Lobotomites are one of the most memorable enemies in FNV. However, they were originally planned to appear as enemies way back in Interplay's Fallout 2. The only remnant of this encounter is a piece of concept art that was ultimately used as a loading screen. During an interview, designer Leonard Boyarsky revealed, "Original sketch for above. Interesting story behind this image. Jason and I had already done a first draft of the story for Fallout 2, and at one point the player was going to be ambushed by lobotomized creatures, lobotomites, when a renegade Brotherhood soldier came to his rescue. It's Fallout Tales number 2, and it was an illustration of a scene from Fallout 2. Of course, the story was changed after Fallout 1 released, but it seemed like a good idea at the time." He expanded even further on this cut storyline in a later interview, stating, They, the Master, created/ran the lobotomite army that was an early threat to the player. The Fallout No. 2 comic cover loading screen was an illustration of a scene we'd envisioned, where the player was being overcome by lobotomites when a desert ranger showed up to hopefully help. It came from the first draft of the Fallout 2 story. The Brotherhood of Steel and Vault 13's Overseer's descendant, and a small group of elite leaders, had made a secret alliance to exchange tech for weapons, safety, etc., and you had to expose or stop them. It was decided that it wasn't strong enough, so we scrapped it and came up with the version that actually was made. I was really happy that there were lobotomites in Old World Blues, incidentally. These quotes provide a fascinating look at Fallout 2's early story. Lobotomites were a great idea, and it's so cool they finally made their way into the series 12 years later. The lobotomite jumpsuit has an unused effect that would reduce your movement speed. The script note reads, adds a hidden perk that reduces the player movement speed by 25%, implying that you wouldn't even be warned about the player's speed decrease. This would have been a very punishing effect, but I suspect it only would have been used during the first quest of the DLC where the player walks around the sink and meets the think tank for the first time. Notably, some of their dialogue mentions feeling heavy as a side effect of the surgery performed on the player, and perhaps you would have originally had this hidden perk during this sequence. Notably, many lobotomites are found at the location Cuckoo's Nest, which is an homage to the Stanley Kubrick film of the same name, a movie that ends with the lead character being lobotomized. There's a uniquely named cut Protectron named Protectron Blue. It's unknown if this is an unused generic enemy or if it was meant for something more. Some of the Night Stalkers, like the ones in X13, were given the Allow Pickpocket setting by mistake. This makes it so you can pickpocket them, unlike pretty much every other creature in the entire game. In the Securitron deconstruction plant, there's a unique Securitron boss using binary for a name. The robot's face is a reference to an early 20th century French film, A Trip to the Moon. Some of the Securitron templates for the DLC don't have their damage threshold set up properly. As a result, some of the Securitron battles are much easier than they were intended to be.
The X-42 giant robo-scorpion is alive! Awaken, my pet! Initiate your search and destroy protocol in the name of all that is Mobius!
Late in the DLC, the player travels to the Forbidden Zone to confront Dr. Mobius. He's guarded by the X-42 giant robo-scorpion, what's easily one of, if not the single best boss battle in New Vegas. If the player is at level 50, the level-scaled version of the Robo-Scorpion will have 3500 HP, far more than any other NPC. In terms of sheer size, it's also the largest NPC that's used. Throughout the facility, the player can find terminals to send Protectron drones after the giant Robo-Scorpion, overload its power supply, make it the target of the facility's turrets, and even shut it down, albeit temporarily. Like other robots, it can be disabled using the Robot Expert perk, but it has the unique ability to restart itself after a short amount of time passes. I can't think of many boss battles throughout the series where you have so many options available to you. The giant Robo-Scorpion is often referred to as the Mega Robo-Scorpion in code, suggesting its name was altered at some point in development. There's also an unused weapon called Mega Robo-Scorpion Claw that was likely used early in development to test the Robo-Scorpion's attacks. It can only be attained via console commands and is set up with various stats for attack speed and damage, but the weapon deals no damage in combat. Notably, the giant Robo-Scorpion was shown at Higgs Village during the trailer. This scene was most likely made specifically for the trailer since it would have had an even harder time moving around there than it does already at X-42. After entering X-42, the player has a short amount of time before the giant Robo-Scorpion attacks them. A script note reads, Grace period before combat initiated. Player has time to take things in before he starts getting blasted. Grace period over. Giant Robo-Scorpion will now come after the player, ready or not. One of the terminals found in the boss fight in the final game reads, "The new atomic laser is putting an incredible strain on the giant Robo-Scorpion's generator. Damn thing shut down right in the middle of weapons testing last week. I pushed for reducing the laser's output by 25%. Instead they slapped a backup generator onto the Scorpion. Dangerous if you ask me. The systems weren't designed to handle the power from two systems at once, and if some rookie tech fires up the backup generator too early, well, internally the previous node is named X42 Power Node 01, but there's also an unused node called X42 Power Node 02. Warning, maximizing power output at this stage could potentially damage or destroy the prototype. Are you sure you wish to proceed? If you chose yes, then you'd get the result text activating backup power. Another terminal in X42's interior can be used to temporarily shut down the giant Robo-Scorpion. There's a related unused note that reads, "The giant Robo-Scorpion's power system has recovered from the power surge that disabled it. There's also an unused effect that would essentially grant the giant Robo-Scorpion the toughness perk, increasing its damage threshold by 10. There's also an unused effect meant for the boss that by its name would have reduced the player's damage threshold. It's set up to use the Bark Scorpion poison code, though this is almost definitely a placeholder effect. I suspect both of these effects were cut to make the boss battle easier." During my interview with Jeff Hughes, I asked him about the creature. The concept for the X42 was created by Avalon, and it was pretty much, there's a giant Robo-Scorpion, homage to Wasteland, guarding Mobius. It was up to me to figure out what it did. So I spent probably 2 weeks just trying out different abilities and scripts to make it feel like a proper boss battle. It was a little challenging since the game generally doesn't handle overly large creatures too well with regards to pathing, so I had to do extra tweaks to prevent the robot from trying to chase the player around. Ultimately it was something like, if the player is outside melee range, always shoot tail, otherwise hit with claws.
Try to leave your dome, think tank, and you will be punished by the pincered might of my Robo-Scorpion army.
There's some notes that suggest that small Robo-Scorpions originally suicide bombed the player, but notes reveal they later changed them to explode after dying. A note in the script linked to them reads, "If the small Scorpion gets below a certain health threshold, let them explode like a bomb. The way they're coded, these little guys would have exploded after having their HP reduced below half." Robo-Scorpion bombers are the most advanced form of the robot and are capable of turning invisible. I suspect the ability to turn invisible was added in after the self-destruct ability was cut, as the bombers are named Robo-Scorpion Suicide internally, though it's possible they once turned both invisible and tried to blow you up. This ability could have made fighting Robo-Scorpions more engaging, and it's too bad it got scrapped. Along with the giant Robo-Scorpion, there's another notable boss, the Legendary Bloatfly, which is found at the location Mysterious Cave. While most bloatflies are little more than cannon fodder, this one fires plasma blasts that deal 300 damage per hit, and it has twice the HP of the legendary Deathclaw, making it one of the most formidable enemies in FNV. During my interview with area designer Jeff Hughes, I asked him about it. The bloatfly was just for fun. We had an empty cave that someone had built, and Charlie Staples said we should put a legendary bloatfly in there, so I did. I goofed around with scripting combat abilities until I finally settled on a super drugged up bloatfly that shot plasma bolts and exploded like a plasma grenade when it died. Good times. After this interview, I followed up with Charlie Staples, and he replied, "I actually saw the idea for the legendary bloatfly on a post in some FNV forum. Don't remember where exactly anymore. Players were going over the various legendary creatures they'd like to see, and someone mentioned a bloatfly and listed crazy stats. I saw that and thought it fit pretty well with the Old World Blues DLC, so we added it in there. I'm pretty happy with how that turned out. It's a good fit, and people had a lot of fun finding it and playing with it with videos. I still have a really old link to this one pitting it against a legendary Deathclaw." As you travel through the Big Empty, enemies respond to various areas as you pass through trigger boxes. This is handled the same way it was done in Honest Hearts, and the encounter script from it was copied over into this DLC, though it was slightly altered. A note by area designer Jorge Salgado reads, "Added new functionality to the encounter list code from NVDLC02, so that encounters are not randomized. Rather, they are pulled from two distinct possibilities for each spawner code box. Old World Blue's exterior world space is meant to have a more discrete partitions of creature types per zone than Zion Valley. Essentially, groups of enemies respond into an inaccessible cell called Encounter Holding Cell, and their strength scales with the player's level. Once the creatures are spawned here, they're teleported into designated locations in the Big Empty as needed to give the player the illusion of a living world. After being killed, code resurrects and resets these creatures for future encounters. If there are more than 2 active random encounters in the world at one time, the earlier encounters will start being disabled to free up resources. Old World Blues doesn't have as many issues with enemies spawning inside of geometry as Honest Hearts, but I did find this trauma harness who spawned inside of the think tank. Not sure if it's related to the fast travel spawn bug we looked at earlier, or if it's a result of the spawning system. There's some interesting oddities related to the spawning system worth noting. Obsidian made creatures for low-level players, but many of them are strangely unused. Notably, most MK2 versions of robots were cut. Female lobotomites are set up and should spawn randomly, but due to an issue with leveled lists, they never spawn this way. The code also mentions several spawns being removed, including several from Little Yangtze and the Botanical Garden. It's unknown if these were cut for balancing or performance reasons. There's a random encounter setup where up to 7 Mr. Gutsies could spawn depending on your level, but due to a scripting error, only up to 5 can ever appear. There's a link to a mod in the description by Push the Win button that fixes this issue thankfully. After dealing with Mobius and recovering your brain from the Forbidden Zone, code is triggered that stops Robo-Scorpions from randomly spawning, but in the process it can actually stop other random encounters from spawning too. After completing the final quest of the DLC, nearly all of the random encounters stop occurring, except for a few, most of which are found inside interiors. This can be fixed by the Keep Big Mountain active mod, and there's a link to that below as well. Another oddity is that unlike Honest Hearts, enemies in this DLC don't fight each other, and instead are all a part of the same faction. Inside the Z14 DNA splicing lab, there's a stair hatch placed outside of bounds just behind the entrance. This can never be seen normally, and clearly once covered the staircase leading down to the dungeon below. I'm guessing the designer who placed it here meant to come back and restore this, but never had time. There's also a mangled body placed beneath the ground in one of the rooms inside Z14 as well. I made a small mod that restores both of these objects, and you can find a link to it below. The interiors of Z14, Z9, and Dr. Boris's house have unattainable surgical masks from Fallout 3 placed inside of them. I think it's because the mask world object mesh is missing, but all 3 are totally invisible in the game world and even in the GEC, except in the object window. Further, they can't be acquired even if you know exactly where they're located. The mask worn by your dad at the start of Fallout 3 is also placed in Camp McCarran, but can't be seen or acquired. This begs the question of how many other invisible objects there are throughout the world, yet another mystery that will likely never be completely solved. It just wouldn't be New Vegas if there weren't even more out-of-bounds objects. Just outside the location X7 left field artillery launch, there's a large number of pipes placed beneath the ground. While props in inaccessible areas are somewhat common in New Vegas, it's rare to find so many of them in the same cell. Just outside this cell, there's yet another underground pipe. Northwest of the think tank, there's another 2 sections of underground pipes beneath the ground inside of a boulder. Not far from here, there's even more of them. Another can be found west of the Securitron deconstruction plant. South of Signal Hill's transmitter, there's even more pipes you'll never see. Right by Signal Hills, there's a kit piece floating inside of the ground. Here's another near Higgs Village, and another by the Cuckoo's Nest. In total, there's well over 40 underground pipes, and I have to think these were moved underground with the intention of them being deleted or repurposed later on, but due to time constraints, they were overlooked. By the Big Mountain East Tunnel, there's some out-of-bounds rocks placed too low to ever be seen. Just outside the perimeter walls near the construction site, there's a skeleton in a duffel bag placed beneath the ground. Alas, you'll never discover his super rare, totally generic clipboard. Inside one of the hexacrete structures near Big Mountain West Tunnel, there's yet another duffel bag you'll never get your hands on. There's an entire large section of railroad found beneath the ground not far from here. Now, in most games, these unseen props would just be interesting artifacts of development, but these objects actually affected the quality of the final product, not just in terms of frame rate, but even more so when you consider just how many objects and NPCs were deleted from the core game in patches to make room for the DLCs. The balcony of the sink is surrounded by a force field in both the PC and 360 releases. Strangely, this force field is completely missing on the PS3, and you can see this when first spawning on the balcony after starting the DLC. A note reveals these were disabled just a few months into development, and they were cut due to performance issues. This force field can be disabled in the versions where it appears, but an invisible wall still stops you from exploring around, unfortunately. The elevator, carriage door, and elevator shaft from Operation Anchorage are present in the game files, but never referenced. It's possible this is related to the stealth testing area in X13, as the door that leads to it is called Elevator Door internally. There's an unused Wild Wasteland graffiti asset that says, "Oh yeah." Presumably this is a reference to the Kool-Aid Man's catchphrase. There's a damaged satellite dish that was never used. This prop is the same asset used for the Virgo 2 dish at the Museum of Technology in Fallout 3. There's some unused early versions of the sink and the think tank left over in the Gek, which are recycled assets from Fallout 3's DLC The Pit. These meshes were later retextured to what appears in the final game. There's an unused, unfinished version of the vending machine found during the Dead Money DLC. In-game, it would have been called Hollow Vending Machine, and it uses the same model as the original version. Both the textures and mesh are present, but the mesh checks for Dead Money's BSA, causing the vending machine to appear incorrectly if both DLCs aren't loaded. Perhaps it would have been found outside the Y0 research facility, as a note here specifically mentions the Sierra Madre vending machines. I'm guessing it wouldn't have been functional as the lab is completely destroyed, but perhaps the player could have used it to acquire new items.
Klein, remember the time you forgot to carry the 2 and nearly blew up the Y0 Research Center? Oh, wait, you did! Or was that me?
Dr. Mobius mentions that Dr. Klein destroyed Y0, but then questions if he didn't do it himself. A note in the dialogue file reveals that Klein was indeed behind its destruction. There's a cool cut door intended for the interior of the Forbidden Dome. In the final game, they ended up using a generic door instead though. The door isn't finished, but the opening and closing animation suggests that Mobius's lair might have been part of the same cell as the main area of X42. There are 4 unused burn decals and quite a few damaged diagrams for the X42 facility that would have been a nice touch for the location. There's a low-quality version of a juniper tree in the game files that was never used. This asset could have injected some visual variety into the world space and would have been a nice touch. If you clip inside the think tank in the Big Mountain world space, you can see these weird statics floating around. They're used to emit the blue imposter light beam seen here at night. These aren't cut, but it's interesting to look behind the curtain and see how this functions. Inside the location X17, the player can find a small-scale version of Higgs Village, and you have an option to trigger a miniature storm, which in turn activates the fountain at the real version of the area. It seems this scene was going to have more going on at one point, as there's an unused Tesla coil from Fallout 3's Broken Steel DLC left over in the BSA. There's also this cut cool switch that was never added, and presumably would have been used to trigger the storm. Inside X8, there's several inaccessible rooms that could only be seen from a catwalk. These rooms are accessible in one of the dungeon's other cells, and were copied over for these inaccessible areas. Containers in inaccessible rooms are typically static objects, but for whatever reason, the boxes and cabinets here still have loot the player can never reach. Several rooms even have items and containers that can't even be seen from the playable area, let alone picked up. In another area, you can see an inaccessible version of the room where Gabe is found. This was copy and pasted over from the real room as well, and as a result, Gabe's digging spots also spawn various items you'll never get your hands on. The code that makes Mobius give the player Mentats has a note that says, Mobius is ready to dispense Mentats, and now he isn't. Mentats. Delicious and smarty. Mobius has some unused lines regarding the X2 and X13 locations that would have played after the player found the X2 antenna and the stealth suit. Both of these lines are in the GEC, but the conditions for them to play were never set up, likely due to an oversight.
X13 breached? No, even that stealth suit won't hide you from my Robo-Scorpion army. Sting the intruder, my pets. Sting them until they are stupid. Trying to steal the X2 transmitter array antenna, are you? You won't succeed. Not if my lethal Robo-Scorpions have any say in the matter.
A note reveals that achievements were reworked at some point in development, but unfortunately all traces of these earlier achievements seem to have been completely deleted. Voice acting is one of this DLC's greatest strengths, but Chris Avallone wanted one voice actor in particular, stating, True confession, it's always been my dream to get Bill Nye the Science Guy to voice a character in one of our games. We tried to get him for Fallout Van Buren and also the New Vegas DLC Old World Blues, and I'm going to keep trying if we go back to the Fallout universe again. I may want to try and convince Alan Moore too. He would have made a great Durance in Eternity. There's an unused image space modifier called Hallucination, and its effects were copied over from the Hallucination effect from Vault 106 and Fallout 3, which would have made the screen blue, along with adding in some radial blur and double vision. The fact they didn't simply reuse the original effect suggests they were going to alter it in some way. It isn't linked to anything else though, and there's no other references to a hallucination sequence. This probably would have been really dope, but it sadly wasn't meant to be. Two of the coolest locations in the world space are Left Field Artillery Launch and Boomtown Target Zone. Originally, Boomtown has 3 partially destroyed houses, but after activating the artillery gun at Left Field, one of the houses is disabled and a crater is enabled, revealing some powerful loot. It's a small but very nice inclusion. The DLC added a new trait called Hot Blooded, and its description reads, when your health drops below 50%, you gain 10% more damage, but you also suffer -2 to your agility and perception attributes. The trait was apparently altered at some point as it actually gives the player a 15% bonus to damage, but the description was never updated. Unlike most interiors, Higgs Village is contained inside a world space. I think the idea was that you were going to be able to see the sky through the cracks in the building, but they set up a sun effect around the building that looks awful, as it clashes with the interior lighting. The Y3 implant is meant to remove all radiation from water sources you drink, but because of the way the perk was set up, it becomes increasingly less effective as the player's radiation resistance improves. As an example, I have 8% rad resistance, drink dirty water, and receive no rads. Now I have 85% rad resistance, the maximum in New Vegas, drink dirty water, and this time end up with +1 rads. There's a link below to a mod that fixes the implant by modder CivisRomanus. While the other members of the Sync are contained in a single NPC faction, Muggy has a unique faction named Muggy's Very Own Faction. The strange hexacrete structures featured in the DLC are one of its most iconic visual elements, and Chris Avellone revealed their purpose. Hexacrete, intended as revolutionary construction method and material that didn't pan out to be revolutionary after repeated tests. The idea was modeled after the concrete plate structure seen in Washington, D.C. in Fallout 3. The hexacrete towers are more simple versions of mass production efforts. Arcade has an empty dialogue topic specifically added by the DLC. Perhaps he once had something to say about the dead member of the followers after the player returned to the Mojave. Arcade also has an empty topic in Dead Money though, so it's very likely unrelated and is probably some kind of test line. There's a quest that checks the voice type of trauma harness creatures, then does nothing. This is enabled when starting a new game and is likely some kind of debug function. Finally, the mysterious broadcast radio station was originally intended to play the song Begin Again from Dead Money. However, the mono and stereo versions of the song don't have the same length, causing it to never play. As a result, nothing plays when the song is supposed to be played, and the radio station instead goes silent. This would have been a nice callback to the first DLC, and it's too bad it doesn't work because of a small issue. Old World Blues is heavily based off of a location in Van Buren named Big Mountain. In Van Buren, it was a lab contained inside a giant geodesic concrete dome known as the Boulder Dome. While the rest of Boulder, Colorado was reduced to ashes by the Great War, Boulder Dome survived as it was designed to withstand nuclear attacks. The design of the structure was reworked for the Think Tank's Dome in the DLC. One of the scientists at Boulder Dome was named Paul, and like Mobius, he had an addiction to mentats. The original think tank was also at Boulder Dome, but according to the design document, the think tank was actually a placeholder name they were going to change later on. They were brains in an aquarium that the player could find in the basement of Boulder Dome, and you could talk to them, as well as implant their brains inside robo-brains. A note in the design document mentions they want to taste things in their aquarium like mentats and Nuka Cola. In Van Buren, brains extracted for use in robo-brains first needed to be wiped by a mind control technique called code. The original think tank were the early subjects of this code research. Just like New Vegas, the members of the think tank were prominent scientists and important people. Notably, Christine was sent after Elijah by the Circle of Steel, a splinter faction of the Brotherhood of Steel. Christine's sniper rifle is a reference to them, and they're also mentioned in some of her audio logs inside Y-17 Medical Facility. They were never planned to appear in New Vegas beyond these small homages, but they were once planned to play a major role in Van Buren before it was cancelled. The Circle of Steel went through 2 iterations in Van Buren, and in the second, they were planned to be a ruthless, fanatical faction, manipulating others through subterfuge and stealth boy use. Nightkin are an example of how stealth boys can drive users insane, and likewise the Circle of Steel would have been nefarious, unstable, and paranoid. The Circle of Steel in New Vegas is actually based off of their original iteration though. In it, they weren't evil, they were just hardliners who thought the rest of the Brotherhood had drifted from the original principles of preserving technology, and they essentially acted as the Brotherhood's internal affairs. It's interesting to see how these unused ideas evolved and eventually made their way back into the franchise's lore. The labs found throughout the Big Empty often feature X, Y, or Z in their names, and during an interview, Chris Avellone revealed how this naming process worked. Beyond the fact that X felt like it was mentioned in a lot of 1950s sci-fi movies, and Y always felt like a good letter in the context of why would someone do this, and Z felt like an extension of, well, we have X and Y, why not Z? There wasn't much thought beyond maintaining the crazy science ambiance to the naming. I do believe for the single Z lab, it was implied that the Z meant that it was a much older lab. To be honest, there isn't much to be gained by trying to decipher a reason behind the think tank's actions, or even Mobius, which is part of their shtick. There was a purpose in the naming scheme if I recall, and there were some labs that we had to be careful of the naming because they ran way too long. Magnetohydraulics was one. Dr. 8 is the most mysterious member of the think tank, an audio engineer whose voice module was reprogrammed, causing him to lose the ability to speak. Despite this, he ironically carries a Meeting People magazine in his inventory. From a production standpoint, this was done because they didn't have the budget to record many new lines, and by making his voice a mishmash of ambient noise, they could include another character without hiring another voice actor. You're forced to decipher what Dr. 8 is actually saying by the player dialogue options you're given. Interestingly, there are notes in the dialogue files that give you an exact description of what he's saying. For example, here's the note for his initial greeting. 8 is surprised by being approached, then alarmed/scared by the player's presence. What? Why are you talking to me? In reply to the weird ambient noises he has as a voice, the player can say, what was that? The note for 8's reply states he's repeating his question angrily. I said, what are you doing here? Why are you talking to me? When you state I have no idea what you're saying right now, then Dr. 8 retorts, like it matters. When you ask who are you, he replies, who am I? I am Dr. 8, audio engineer at this facility. When the player inquires, do you know anything about Dr. Mobius or the Forbidden Zone, he states, Dr. Mobius? Where? Is he here? He'll destroy us all. If told there's a pattern to your speech or something, he says, why yes, that's correct. Well done. The previous line has a rare text prompt, something that isn't used often in New Vegas. You're emitting characters and patterns of 8 bracketed with tone. If you say, did something happen with your voice module, 8 replies, sort of. It's hard to explain, but yes, the voice module is broken. When the player states, alright, just calm down, didn't mean to alarm you, he says, I apologize for my emotional display, but it is a serious matter what you have brought up. When told, you sound a little down, there is a note that states, it's seen better days, better times, long ago. If you tell 8 no need to get indignant, was just asking a question, he tells you, you need to learn manners. If told, you sound agitated or you're percolating or something, he says, don't be a fool, you must retrieve them. If you tell him that his work sounds important, he says, I have a very important role here doing stuff. If you tell him, trust me, I'll get the technologies, alright? He states, you need to hurry. If you ask, how did you fire up the sonic emitter when I arrived again? He says, a little embarrassed about this, but yes, I creamed hard into your gun. In reply, you can say, well, there has to be some other way to fire it up. Can we at least talk it over next time? Then he says, yes. Sorry about that. After this, a male player can say, I can find some cram laying around. Put some duct tape around the lid, good to go. While a female player character can state, I usually just take a fusion cell and oscillate its charge. Vibrates for like an hour. 8 replies to both lines the same way. That's not a bad idea, thanks. The code that handles this part of 8's dialogue has a note that reads, added ejaculation check, be masturbate. This is a hell of a DLC. The variable is then actually used and has a note that says, ask 8 about sonjaculation. Gives you options when you return. Make sure that 8 gives the masturbate tech only once every 3 days. One hell of a DLC indeed. Afterwards you can say, I'm just full of surprises, or, well, I just heard the rhythm and the sequence is all. He replies, I am quite impressed. If you ask him about the technologies that Klein wants, he says, these technologies are extremely dangerous, I think, but they are all that will protect us. If you ask him about the Big Empty, he says, Big Empty? I don't know of any such place. If you instead ask him about Big Mountain, he replies, well, it's the nexus of all our research. Our home, you might say. When returning and speaking to him again, he has several funny greetings like, you're back? I can't believe you keep going out there. What? Oh, it's you. Dr. 8 detects incoming transmission. Dr. 8 is indignant here. He didn't do anything, and Dr. 8 suggests a plan of action. The rest of 8's lines are either missing, share the same notes as other lines we've already covered, or just aren't particularly interesting.
I'll get you, my pretty, and your little dog too.
Sci-fi film and television were one of the add-on's greatest inspirations, but one of the more obvious inspirations comes from the classic 1939 film Wizard of Oz. The player is transported from their reality into a magical new world where they search for their heart, spine, and brain, which mirrors the Tin Man trying to find his heart, the Lion trying to find courage or his spine, and the Scarecrow finding his brain. During dialogue, Dr. Mobius specifically references this.
In short, brains, a heart, and courage. Spine. I think there was a story once where a band of murderous thugs sought these things. They had them all the time in the story. Didn't stop them from murdering to get them. And it won't stop the think tank either.
Mobius is also initially depicted as the DLC's antagonist, and can be compared to the Wicked Witch of the West, who utilizes flying monkeys as henchmen, while Mobius uses robo-scorpions. Much like the Wizard of Oz himself, it's later revealed that Dr. Mobius isn't what he seems. The Big Mountain Transponder is similar to Dorothy's shoes, which transports the player back and forth from the Big Empty to the Mojave.
Yeah, crazy, right? Something right out of a midnight science fiction feature. Ridiculous. What are the odds?
During another interview, Chris Avallone spoke in depth about the DLC's inspirations. Old World Blues is built around the history of Fallout games we've worked on. It's history that's created history, with a dash of what might have been from past games, media, and design documents from Fallout 1, 2, and past Fallout projects given new life. From lobotomites, DNA splicing, cazadors, night stalkers, where the hell did those plants in the Mojave come from? The scientific enclave of Big Mountain itself, proton weapons, and giant robo-scorpions. All of these things form the nucleus of taking a trip into the past as present Fallout universe to see a slice of the old world that's been fenced in and feeding on itself for far too long. We wanted you to see the context and homages to the Fallout universe in a scientific preserve, both from the distant Fallout past to more recent adventures in New Vegas and the DLCs. And you'll discover Big Mountain, or the Big Empty, is filled with what might have been, and all that was lost that potentially could have made a better world for all. There's an undercurrent of the blues all around Big Mountain, but if you're strong enough, you can change it and the whole meaning of Old World Blues forever. Designing Old World Blues was an adventure in itself. It involved taking a trip down memory lane, both in terms of past games and also in terms of 1950s sci-fi cinema to get the exaggerated science feel, where a great many inventions were atomic and anything nuclear promised amazing things for the future, usually with an exclamation mark. Over the course of Old World Blues, we watched and paid respect to some of the 50s science fiction films like Brain from the Planet Eros, Things to Come, Forbidden Planet, When Worlds Collide, The Deadly Mantis, Tarantula, The Mole People, although we pushed some of that out for the next DLC, The Monolith Monsters, and more. There's also a little Wizard of Oz thrown in for good measure, although it's in the Fallout context. It's worth noting that Old World Blues has the least connection to the core game of any of the DLCs. While the base game has dialogue references and graffiti that foreshadow Dead Money, Honest Hearts, and Lonesome Road, the only connection this DLC really has to the Mojave are Night Stalkers, Cazadors, and Spore Carriers. Chris Avallone revealed how some voice actors inspired character changes during development. There is one wrinkle in the process, however, and that's sometimes, once we get an audition that we really like, we will rewrite a character or change their tone because we think it'll complement the actor better. Ulysses and Fallout New Vegas changed as soon as I heard Roger Cross's voice, and I kept his audition playing in the background while I was writing, and it helped me give direction for the character. In addition, once we got James Urbanak for the role of Dr. O in the think tank in Old World Blues, I rewrote Dr. O from the frenetic, hyperactive newscaster personality I intended, and had more fun with doing a scientist who's aware he's not brilliant or valued, which I thought might be a nice change from the Venture brothers, where Rusty Venture's arrogance tends to blind him to that realization 99.9% of the time. And we take chances on new talent. Veronica Belmont surprised me in Old World Blues. I don't think she'd done any voice acting up until that point. I had no idea how she'd be in the studio, but she really delivered her lines well, and we were lucky to have Roger Cross in the studio at the same time, so they could do their lines between each other, which works much better and is rare to be able to pull off. A common complaint about Old World Blues is the length of the think tank's dialogue at the start of the DLC. During my interview with Chris Avallone, he revealed this was mandated by Obsidian's management. It was telling that upper management wasn't as involved with New Vegas as other projects at that time, like they had been with Sega and then Square Enix, both of which didn't go to great places and kind of ruined future opportunities. Upper management was barely involved with the DLCs beyond mandating some exposition moments. It's the reason why the openings are sometimes dialogue heavy. It's because they were worried that players wouldn't understand what was going on. Script notes suggest they also considered giving the player the choice to skip the intro cinematic, which while great the first time, it would have been nice to at least have the option to skip it in future playthroughs. With the experience of the core game, Dead Money, and Honest Hearts under their belts, Old World Blues features some of the best area design in New Vegas. In an interview, Chris Avallone revealed part of the team's process for creating the Big Empty. We didn't have much to work with narrative-wise, so we told stories in prop placement, journals, and even in item names. We had narrative docs for specific locations in the game that had no text, but detailed exactly how the prop should be placed. For example, the Little Yangtze location, I needed to reinforce that 1. Elijah set up a temp camp inside the watchtower, 2. Christine snuck in the destroyed building outside the Chinese concentration camp to watch Elijah, and as the best sniping position. And 3. A huge battle took place here when a horde of robots tried to capture Elijah and failed. So here's how I would suggest design placement in tandem with the world builder, starting with Christine's sniping spot / observation post. Again, the naming of the inventory item and the prop placement tells the explorer exactly what was going on here. Christine's sniping spot. In the opposite side of Little Yangtze is a ruined building that Christine was using to spy on Elijah before all hell broke loose. Should have binoculars, a first aid kit, and a sniper rifle leaning up against the wall near a spot that gives a good view of the tower. Should be an empty bottle and steady here. Spent shells and an ammo case with sniper rifle ammo would be good. Still, that isn't enough. So we requested the sniper rifle be changed to a unique variant, Christine's Circle of Steel silencer rifle that's auto-modded with suppressor and carbon fiber by default, which both gives the name of the owner and a clue that whoever the sniper is, she's pretty skilled at her craft. And it gets more complicated with Elijah's placement, but here's how I might describe Elijah's placement with specifics. Outside the tower, put binoculars on the side facing the dome. Elijah was occasionally popping out to check on the dome to make sure no one was coming to grab him. Also put ham radios near the binoculars and around the perimeter of the tower railing, as if Elijah was trying to pick up frequencies, and have one tiny satellite dish pointing towards the communication center to the northeast. Inside the watchtower, place scrap terminal parts, use the hauled out computer terminal models, a working terminal will include log entries, and transfer as much of the feel of Elijah's BOS bunker and Dead Money into the watchtower. Tattered bedrolls, burned books on the floor, toolbox with tools lying around, and if at all possible, put deactivated bomb collars. Should be normal models with different names on the tables. should also be a radio that Elijah left on. On the floor should be a poster of the Sierra Madre, which Elijah laid out there to remind him of his destination. If possible, I'd love to have a ghoul with a bomb collar laid out on the floor, as if someone was dissecting it. Scalpel, surgical tubing, along with other equipment, including radios around it. If we can put the ghoul body in one of the X jumpsuits from Dead Money, that would be welcome. Outside perimeter of Little Yangtze. Whatever we can do with props to emphasize that waves of ghouls with bomb collars were sent against the Sentry and other robots sent to capture Elijah to destroy them should be placed here. Elijah also activated automated turrets to wipe out attackers as well, so if we have destroyed versions of those, that would also make sense. And also, it was important that everyone knew what the paths for each of the major DLC characters was throughout Big Mountain, so we visually laid that out using a top-down view of the whole DLC. Usually we have a big BMP file, and we add pathing layers to it, including a graffiti pass, Ulysses left flag symbols, red for danger, blue for cachet or something interesting, and white for safety, and where those were placed in the DLC were important. These design images trace the characters' paths, critical movements. Elijah, Little Yangtze, Ulysses frees Christine from the medical center and takes her to his camp. As a result of this, Ulysses' camp might read, "This is Ulysses' base camp where he went to scout/scavenge the Big Empty." As such, it should have relics from all over the Big Empty organized carefully around the camp area. Leave a tiny satellite dish inside along with radios. That would be good. It should feel like a military-efficient camp, but not trapped like the Survivalist Cave. Ulysses deactivated all of his camp defenses when he left Big Mountain. Ulysses should have a few ammo boxes as well with carefully organized ammo. SMGs, pistols, knife, landmines, and pulse mines. Some reloading bench crafting materials, powder, shells, SMG cases. And empty holodisk and books he's gathered from the Big Empty. Burned books, stacked carefully, since he sorts and reads them. Ulysses' sleeping area should have a bedroll, a hot plate, campfire, and some stacks of food by it on shelves, carefully organized, not scattered. He would also have plenty of better drink and have gathered plants from around the Big Empty as well. Think shaman caves from Honest Hearts. Ulysses carried Christine back here to have her heal up. Include a first aid box for Christine, empty bottles, dish, a bedroll/cot for her to lie on with scalpels, lots of blood nearby, and other first aid equipment nearby. Include Ulysses' map in the area, a note with no text, that gives COC locations to a number of areas of the Big Empty, notably Little Yangtze, Medical Center, and especially the weather station, the escape tunnel, Night Stalker Den, and Elijah's Watch. Include a Christine's log here on a hollow disk near the bedroll in an obvious location. In another post, Chris Avallone expanded on the DLC environmental design even further. There's a few things you do with a seemingly large empty location. Take Fallout New Vegas Old World Blues, which takes place inside a giant self-contained crater surrounded by pylons that shock you unconscious when you leave. So you have this big bowl. You don't have much resources to create new models or new locations, so you have to sit down and examine the experience you can make. Here's how you fill it up in detail, especially when you have next to no resources to generate content. Open your toolbox and lay out the tools you do have. If you can't make new assets, scavenge assets and play around with them in new ways. Recognize that there is a wealth of props and geometry that has been created for Fallout 3, the Fallout 3 DLC, and for New Vegas itself. Examine each piece of content, and we did, as to how we could use it to make new adventure areas. Even things like file cabinets, silos, and even areas used in the main game can be placed, twisted, given a new context, and made into an interesting explorable space. So this may seem obvious. Don't make large open spaces. A plane stretching off into infinity is the player's equivalent of hell. A big bowl is a big bowl, so instead, break it up, both visually and with sublevels whenever possible. Use pipes, trees, stairs, fencing, buildings to break up the space, and break up the encounters. Even a seemingly empty space bisected with props is more interesting on the eye than a stretch of open ground. And as a side note, occluding geometry, for example, solid fencing, helps with level design because it limits how many polygons are on screen at any one time. Breaking the player's line of sight with something interesting for them to process and navigate around rather, is far preferable than seeing a stretch of open ground with nothing between them, and a destination far, far in the distance. Add system elements to empty space. Crafting elements, crafting benches, loot containers, locked doors, landmines, safes. These are easy to place and give a wide range of system challenges for the player. You could make almost any stretch of ground or cul-de-sac in New Vegas interesting by putting a crafting plant/loot plant there. As an example, dropping a brand new crafting recipe in an area can suddenly spark the player to view the location's item placement differently, and go scavenging for certain items for the new recipe he's found items he previously would have ignored. Make spectrums of encounters as well. Fights are easy to place, for example, and it's surprisingly easy to give them variety in the engine with naming, stat adjustments, weapon switching. Give them fire, give them rockets, and changing the name of an enemy can even help tell the story of a location. And by combining two enemy types in a new way, having a robot escort healing the bad guys you're fighting as it's carrying out its pre-war programming. Aside from systems and encounters, you can also include navigation puzzles and exploration puzzles, hidden items, puzzles to navigate the environment, etc. I tend to call these non-quests that still drive the player to complete them without a journal entry. To explain, formal quests require a lot of time investment to special case. They usually require voiceover, and there's simpler ways to communicate objectives, and the Fallout equivalent of dungeon crawling without creating a whole new town and a location. Wait, I see smoke. From what looks like a camp on the ridge, how the hell do I get up there? Lastly, delete it, or find a way to take that dead space and make it a non-traversable cool vista. A lot of the vistas in Lonesome Road. If you really are just adding filler, you should just cut it in my opinion. A bigger game isn't a better game. Although the pylons do teleport you back to your new HQ, they can be used as fast travel if you want. I requested that much. I didn't want them solely to be obstacles if you could make use of them.
There is an expression in the wasteland, old world blues.
It refers to those so obsessed with the past they can't see the present, much less the future, for what it is.
They stare into the what was, eyes like pilot lights, guttering and spent, as the realities of their world continue on around them.
In many ways, this quote from the DLC's ending encompasses not only this series of videos, but my feelings about the Fallout series itself. A melancholy longing for what was and will likely never be again. Despite having the longest development cycle and highest budget, Old World Blues still has a surprising number of cut, fascinating ideas that would have made it into an even better DLC. Ultimately though, all of this was left on the cutting room floor.